Hi chess friends, this is another example of the decline variation in the Benko Gambit. And this is a game between the two renowned grandmasters Vladimir Bagirov and Lars Bo Hansen. Although that game is from 1989, it shows us a very instructive idea to play for black. Many white players started to decline the nice offer. Why? If you take on a6 as white, you give black two semi-open queenside files for the rooks, and with the bishop on g7, black has more than enough compensation for the missing pawn. He's got a lot of pressure on the queen side, and a very easy development and a very easy opening. So this is why many players try to complicate matters for black and give him less activity by giving back the pawn. You should take that pawn immediately, and this is how the game proceeded. And the first advantage is that the first advantage from the white's perspective is that white's castling rights are not being destroyed by a bishop on a6. g6, a4, bishop g7 and a5, queen to d8, bishop c4, maybe waiting for the knight to come to d7, blockading the bishop on c8, which you shouldn't do yet. You are actually waiting with this bishop for this knight, so you can immediately pin it. In the declined variation, I have to emphasize that in the declined variation you want to take off that knight. Why? Black is restricted on the queen file a little bit, and white can use this knight to come to c4 this way, and this was the idea in the previous example of the Benko Gambit declined, in the previous clip on this channel. So this is why castles is played by Hansen here, and knight f3 was Bagirov's move, and bishop g4 immediately, and taking off that knight, so there's no knight coming to c4 from now on. Let's just drop back. What if white would try to anticipate that by going, for example, h3 or f3? Well, in both cases you would open up the game on the e-file immediately, taking advantage of the king, which is still stuck in the middle. And this one tempo of playing f3 leads to very uncomfortable play for white. e6 very early, castles, takes, attacking the rook on a8, so rook a7, queen c2, now you exchange off that bishop, and now you see clearly that this knight is coming to c6, and well, what to do if bishop f4, for example. You can play knight c6 and say queen d2, renewing the threat on to take on d6. You can play simply knight b4, and if takes, you can take that off, and knight d3 looks very active here. Defends that pawn here. So this is one example. If you don't want to play this way, if you want to play more safe, then you can, in this position, play rook e6 or bishop f8. Bishop f8 would be too passive. Let's go this way, and if rook d1, well, we can take this knight here. So white cannot go on with his attack. let's drop back to this position. This explains why anticipating bishop g4 doesn't work, and if knight e2 immediately to answer bishop g4 with f3, well, then the knight cannot come to c4, at least not very easily. It would take ages. So then you would go on with your plan. Then you can blockade in that bishop because the knight cannot be pinned, and you can go on with your typical play. What you can do as well is play knight g4 and then knight d7 if the knight is not attacked, and then knight to e5 or knight to e5 next move. Yeah. Knight f3 was Bagirov's move, and Hansen pinned the knight as prescribed. h3, and we take off that knight without any hesitation whatsoever. And as I said, this idea of taking off that knight on f3 is the idea of the declined variation. Knight bd7, queen e2, because knight e5 was threatened, gaining time on the queen, taking on c4. Knight e5 anyway, giving that a pawn, which is a kinda delayed gambit. Queen c7, which prepares pawn to c4 to trap the bishop, which has to go out or to retreat via b5. But now we can take back the rook. Takes, and now white again is ahead in pawns. And Hansen played queen b4 here. He could have taken off that piece immediately and play rook b8, and you see that black has a lot of indirect and direct activity. Okay, and if well, b4 doesn't work in this position, that could be taken off, and the engines don't see a way to keep that pawn protected. They even suggest bishop e3. Well, in that position you can wait with taking on b2. You can play this way and develop your queenside attack. Queen b4 was Hansen's move, and bishop a2 was the answer. Rook c8, preparing knight c4 maybe. King h2 prepares f2 f4. Knight d7 to anticipate that gain of time by white, which is a grandmaster idea. If f4 is going to be played, you don't do anything else and wait for white to play it. I don't know, some random move. You don't do that because you could misplay. You rather make the move which is forced one move later anyway, so it isn't under any circumstances of pressure. f4 and knight c5. e5 and knight fe4. That was taken off, and bishop b1 attacking it, and knight back to c5. Now this position could look very nice for white because of its bishop pair against bishop and knight, but it's not so. There are two pluses to black. Firstly, he didn't commit his pawn structure too much as white did, so black's pawn structure is more solid and flexible in the same at the same time. And the second advantage to black's position is his activity. All his pieces are in very good locations. King h1 was played, and knight b3 attacking the bishop. Bishop e3, and now takes, and white wins the e-pawn. This is what I said and tried to emphasize with black's pawn structure, having more flexibility and potential. Queen f3, and the bishop dropped back. Queen f2, knight a5 attacking b2, and also heading to d6, blockading the passed pawn. Bishop a2 and knight b7 would blockade the passed pawn and the bishop in this case, which is a very good move. Queen b2 instead would be less good, because d6 could be played, and if takes, knight c6, then takes, and the bishop would be hanging, so king g7, g4, with the idea of pushing g5, so the bishop would have to retreat, and then white could take on f7 with check. So to anticipate that, black would have to play g5, and after h4, h6 and h5, black's bishop would be looking rather stupid, hemmed in by its own pawns, and black is under some pressure here. He is rather inflexible. You can see that with the mistake knight takes e7, which would lead to checkmate, believe it or not. So to anticipate that, knight b7 was played, playing in the Nimzovician manner, blockading passed pawns. d6 was played anyway, but in a way better circumstances for black. Bishop f4, rook a8, and bishop d5, rook d8, rook e1, and knight f5. The knights are very strong when it's about reduced or only when the game is only on one side at the board. For mostly, the bishops would be better if there would be more pawns on the board, then they would have more potential. But you see, this knight is very flexible and strong. Bishop e4, and now this knight is supporting the bishop on h4 and d4. In this position, the engines say rook d4 is very strong, and after queen e2, bishop h4 attacking the rook. g3 is not possible, so if the bishop would take on f5, you would take on f4, and now two pieces would be hanging. Instead, Hansen played another strong move, bishop d4, queen e2, and knight d6, bishop f3, and bishop f6. Now you see the b2 pawn is still attacked, and black is very solid. Black's king is very solid. Say white would try to keep this pawn, that would lead to very strong play for black, with gain of time. If queen f2 to prevent the loss of the queen, bishop h4, and if g1 is the only square for the queen, then check and queen b8, which can run into check very soon, winning material for black. And the interesting thing in this position is that the queen has no square. it has absolutely no square. Of course, f1 is controlled as h1. On f2, the bishop would win the queen with or the knight would win the queen with knight e4 check, discovered check. On e3, the knight would win the queen via f5, or f1, double check. This is covered by the rook, and the c5 square is covered by knight e4, discovered check, and the other squares are controlled by the queen. So the queen would be lost. If rook d1 here, you can take that off and check. On h1, knight f2 would win the queen immediately. So check, check, winning the queen this way. On f1, there is mate, so the queen loss is unavoidable. Let's drop back. So this is why bishop c1 is no good. Rather, rook d1 was played, losing the bishop here. And rook d5 to prevent bishop e5, and rook c8 is penetrating to the first rank. And in this position, Bagirov resigned to Hansen, because if rook d1, bishop e5, and this is simply winning. If g4, well, there are different paths to victory here. One would be simply exchanging off the remaining pieces. So let's drop back. In this position, white resigned. I hope you liked the video. Let's summarize. After the declining of the pawn, you see that the knight should be pinned after it's coming to f3. This is why you castle instead of blockading in your bishop on c8. Knight f3 leads to bishop g4 as prescribed. Let's go back, and if white anticipates that, you simply open up the game. And by allowing black to take off that knight, black had a very good game here with knight to e5 and the typical Benko Gambit counterplay, even in the declined variations. And you saw that due to black's pawn structure, which is less committed, black's position has more potential than white. And you saw that long term, white couldn't manage his committed pawns, which are rather targets than attacking forces. I hope you liked the video. Please subscribe, comment, and like if you did. Thanks.